September 3rd, 1943, 1008. 147 hours above the English Channel. The modified B-17F Flying Fortress that lifted off from RAF Thurleigh that evening carried something the 8th Air Force had spent 2 years trying to prevent. A woman manning the waist gun position. The men and the crew had another name for what was about to unfold. The end of everything they thought they knew about aerial combat. What followed wasn't just day of protocol, but a complete shattering of assumptions about who could fight at 25, 0 FT, where the temperature dropped to minus 40 degrees F, and enemy fighters appeared as dark crosses against an indifferent sky. The personnel file that sat on Colonel Richard Patterson's desk at 8th Air Force Headquarters in High Wycombe, England, represented what military bureaucracy considered an impossibility. Service number W2, 184,719, gunnery qualification scores that ranked in the 98th percentile, combat readiness assessment marked exceptional. And one detail that made the entire file an administrative nightmare, gender female. Sergeant Anne Fletcher had done something that wasn't supposed to be possible in 1943. She had become the highest-scoring aerial gunner in her training class at Tyndall Army Airfield in Florida, outperforming 247 male candidates on both the ground ranges and in the modified bombers used for training runs over the Gulf of Mexico. The scores were undeniable. On the moving target range at Tyndall, Fletcher had achieved 89% accuracy with the Browning M2, 50 caliber machine gun at ranges exceeding 400 YD. The average male graduate scored 64%. A Mosquite range designed to simulate aerial combat deflection shooting, she had hit 94 out of 100 clay targets. The class average was 58, but there was a problem that had nothing to do with her abilities. Army Regulations 615-135, established in 1942, explicitly prohibited women from assignments involving direct combat operations. The Women's Army Corps, created just 1 year earlier, had been carefully designed to keep women away from the front lines. They could serve as mechanics, as radio operators, as meteorologists, any role that supported combat without actually engaging in it. Fletcher's situation had emerged from what military historians would later call bureaucratic chaos, meeting desperate necessity. She had enlisted in the Women's Army Corps in January 1943, one of 12 women who joined in the program's first 6 months. Her application listed her occupation as aircraft mechanic based on 5 years working at her father's aircraft repair service in Wichita, Kansas. What the recruitment officers didn't know, because she hadn't mentioned it and they hadn't asked, was that Thomas Fletcher hadn't just taught his daughter how to repair aircraft. He had taught her how to shoot. Thomas Fletcher had served as an aerial observer in the final months of World War I, flying in the back seat of DH-4 bombers over the Western Front. He had returned home with 3 things: a distinguished service cross chronic nightmares that made him wake up scanning the sky for enemy aircraft, and an absolute conviction that the next war would be won or lost in the air. He had trained in the way he wished he had been trained in 1918. Starting when she was 12 years old, he had taught her deflection shooting using a shotgun and clay targets launched from a hand trap. By the time she was 16, she could hit targets thrown at any angle while she stood on a moving truck bed. Leading a target isn't about thinking, he had told her 1,000 times. It's about seeing where the target is going to be and putting your shot there before your brain catches up. When it arrived at Fort Des Moines in Iowa for basic WAC training in February 1943, she had no intention of revealing her shooting skills. She understood the regulations. She knew what roles were available to women in the military. She was prepared to serve as a mechanic and was genuinely content with that prospect. The moment that changed everything occurred during the 3rd week of basic training. a gunnery instructor from Tyndallfield, had arrived to give a demonstration on aerial combat tactics. He had set up a ski range and was showing the trainees, both male soldiers and WAC members, how aerial gunners train to hit fast-moving targets. "It's all about deflection," the instructor had explained, demonstrating the technique of shooting ahead of the moving clay target. "You don't aim at where the target is, you aim at where it's going to be. Most men take months to get the instinct for it." Some never do. He had invited volunteers to try. 3 male soldiers had attempted it. All 3 had missed every target. The instructor had shrugged. "See, it's harder than it looks. Takes weeks of practice to even hit one." And Fletcher had stepped forward. "May I try, sir?" The instructor had glanced at his clipboard, seen she was whack, and smiled indulgently. "Sure, miss, give it a shot." No pun intended. She had picked up the shotgun, called for the target, and shattered 6 clay pigeons in succession without a miss. The range had gone completely silent. The instructor had stared at her, then at the remains of the targets scattered across the field. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" he had asked. "My father taught me, sir. He was an aerial observer in the last war." The instructor had written down her name and service number. Within a week, she had received orders transferring her to Tyndall Army Airfield for evaluation of specialized skills. The orders came from high enough in the command structure that no one at Fort Des Moines questioned them. At Tyndall, she had entered what was supposed to be a TUI evaluation. The gunnery instructors wanted to determine if her ski range performance was a fluke or represented genuine aptitude. They put her through every test in the aerial gunnery program. She excelled at all of them. On the stationary range, firing at targets 600 y.d. distant, she grouped her shots tighter than men who had been training for months. On the moving target range, tracking targets pulled across her field of fire by cables, she maintained accuracy that the instructors had rarely seen. In the modified B-24 used for training flights, firing at towed aerial targets over the Gulf of Mexico, she had achieved hit rates that put her at the top of her class. The problem was that she wasn't supposed to have a class. Women weren't trained as aerial gunners, but once she was in the training program, no regulation explicitly said she had to be removed. She had simply continued advancing through the curriculum because no one with sufficient authority had thought to stop her. By August 1943, the 8th Air Force was dying in the sky over Germany. The statistics told a story that terrified everyone who understood them. The average crew survival rate for bomber missions over German-occupied Europe was 25 missions. The problem was that each crew was required to complete 25 missions before rotating home. Mathematically, this meant that most crews wouldn't survive their tour of duty. The losses at RAF Thurleigh, home to the 306th Bombardment Group, painted the picture in blood and burning aluminum. In July 1943, the group had lost 9 B-7s in a single week. Each bomber carried 10 men. 90 air crew members had died or been captured in 7 days. The replacement pipeline couldn't keep up. Training a complete bomber crew took 6 months minimum. Creating a skilled aerial gunner required 12 weeks of intensive training. The 8th Air Force was losing gunners faster than training facilities could produce them. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Davies, operations officer for the 306th Bombardment Group, found himself managing a crisis that had no good solutions. He had 3 B-7 sitting on the hard stands that couldn't fly combat missions because they lacked full crews. He had pilots, co-pilots, bombarders, and navigators. What he didn't have was enough qualified gunners. The B-17F Flying Fortress required 6 gunner positions, 2 waist guns, a ball turret gun, a tail gun, a top turret gun, and a nose gun. Each position demanded specific skills and training. You couldn't simply hand a rifle-trained infantryman a .050 caliber machine gun and expect him to hit enemy fighters attacking at 300 mph from varying angles while wearing electrically heated suits and oxygen masks at 25, 0, 00FT. Davies had received a telegram from 8th Air Force Headquarters in late August that made his situation even more complicated. The message informed him that a specialist aerial gunner would be arriving at Fleet for temporary assignment. The telegram included service number W2, 184,719, but either through intentional omission or bureaucratic oversight did not include a first name. When Sargent and Fletcher stepped off the transport truck at RAF Thurleigh on August 29, 1943, carrying her duffel bag in her orders, the reaction from the ground crew was immediate confusion, followed by barely suppressed panic. Staff Sergeant Robert Hayes, the crew chief who signed for arriving personnel, had looked at her, looked at his clipboard, and looked at her again. "There's been a mistake, miss. This is a bomber base. The WAC billets are at Fletcher," had handed him her orders. "No mistake, Sergeant. I'm assigned to the 306th Bombardment Group as an aerial gunner." Hayes had read the orders 3 times, hoping the words would change. They didn't. He had walked Fletcher to the operations office, where Lieutenant Colonel Davies had experienced a similar sequence of emotions. Confusion, disbelief, and then the dawning realization that he was facing a problem with no clear solution. Sergeant Fletcher Davies had said carefully, "There must be some mistake. Women aren't assigned to bomber crews. I'm aware of the regulations, sir. I didn't request this assignment, but my orders are valid and my gunnery qualifications are in my file." Davies had opened her personnel file. The gunnery scores were there, undeniable and exceptional. He had made 3 phone calls to 8th Air Force Headquarters. The first 2 reached officers who assured him there must be an error and they would look into it. The third reached a colonel who told Davies something that changed his understanding of the situation. "Davies, this comes from the top. General Armstrong himself approved this. We're losing this war in the air right now. We're losing men faster than we can train them. Fletcher's scores are better than 90% of the gunners we're sending up. If she can shoot, we need her shooting. Figure out how to make it work." Davies had hung up the phone and looked at Fletcher, who stood at attention in front of his desk. "Sergeant, do you understand what you're volunteering for? The life expectancy for bomber crews. I know the statistics, sir. I also know you have bombers sitting on the ground because you don't have enough gunners." She was right. Davies had 3 B-7s that couldn't fly for lack of full crews. He had missions scheduled that he couldn't fulfill because he couldn't put complete crews in the air. For 5 days, Fletcher existed in a bureaucratic limbo at Fleet. She was assigned to a barracks building that housed ground crew members. She attended briefings but wasn't assigned to any crew. The male gunners at the base treated her with a mixture of curiosity, skepticism, and in some cases, open hostility. The skepticism came from a place Davies understood. These men were dying at a rate that made long-term survival a mathematical improbability. They had formed tight bonds with their crew members based on trust that each person could perform under the most extreme conditions imaginable. The presence of a woman, any woman, regardless of her qualifications, represented an unknown variable that could get them killed. The test flight that changed everything occurred on September 2, 1943. Davies had authorized Fletcher to participate in a training flight aboard a B-17F designated Liberty Bell. The mission was a standard practice run over the English countryside. No combat, no risk, just an opportunity to evaluate her performance in an actual bomber. The aircraft commander was Captain James Thornton, a veteran of 14 combat missions who had made his skepticism about Fletcher's presence abundantly clear. "With respect, sir," he had told Davies, "my crew has been through hell together. We trust each other with our lives. I don't know this person. Consider it a training evaluation, Captain. She's going up. Your job is to assess whether she can do what her scores say she can do." The flight had taken off at 0600 hours. For 2 hours, the B-7 had flown practice formations with other bombers from the group. Fletcher had manned one of the waist gun positions, going through the mechanical drills of clearing jams, changing ammunition belts, and tracking simulated targets through her gun sight. At 081, 5 hours, something happened that wasn't supposed to be possible during a training flight. A German Fallwolf FW-190 fighter, probably lost or on a reconnaissance mission, had appeared at their altitude and had made what Thornon later described as either an attack run or the most aggressive close pass I've ever seen. The German fighter had come in from 400 high, a classic attack angle that gave the FW-190 a speed advantage as it dove toward the bomber formation. It had closed to within 800 YD before the top turret gunner had spotted it and called out the warning. Fletcher had been at the starboard waist gun. She had rotated her .050 caliber machine gun to track the incoming fighter, calculated the deflection angle in the split second available, and opened fire with a 3-second burst. The B-7's combat camera, which ran automatically during all flights, had captured what happened next. The gun camera footage showed Fletcher's tracer rounds converging on the fighter's projected flight path. The FW-190 had flown directly into her stream of fire. The fighter's engine had erupted in smoke, and the aircraft had rolled inverted and dived away, trailing black smoke. When Liberty Bell landed at fully at 0947 hours, Captain Thornton had climbed out of his aircraft, walked directly to where Fletcher was exiting through the waist gun hatch, and extended his hand. That was a perfect deflection shot, Sergeant. Textbook. I've seen veteran gunners miss that angle. The gun camera footage had been reviewed by Davies and his operations staff. The deflection angle Fletcher had calculated required her to aim approximately 30 ft ahead of the fighter's current position to compensate for the FW-90 speed and the bomber's own motion. She had done it instinctively in less than 2 seconds. Davies had called Fletcher into his office that afternoon. "Sergeant, I'm assigning you to Lieutenant Raymond Cooper's crew. They're flying a mission tomorrow. They lost their starboard waist gunner 3 days ago over Emden. You'll take that position." "Yes, sir, Sergeant Fletcher. I need to be clear about something. If you fly this mission, you'll be the first American woman to fly combat operations in this war. There are people at higher headquarters who will have strong opinions about that. Some of those opinions will not be supportive. Do you understand?" "I understand, sir. Permission to speak freely." "Granted, sir. Those men are dying because they don't have enough trained gunners. I'm trained. I can do this job." "That should be the only thing that matters." Davies had nodded slowly. "In a perfect world, Sergeant, you'd be right. We don't live in a perfect world, but we do live in one where we're losing this war in the air. And I need every qualified gunner I can get." "You're qualified. Go prove it. September 3rd, 1943, 0430 hours, the briefing room at RAF Thurleigh held 120 men and 1 woman. The target map revealed what everyone had feared when they were awakened at 0400 Stuttgart, Germany. Deep in enemy territory, defended by hundreds of anti-aircraft guns and dozens of fighter squadrons, Fletcher sat in the back row of the briefing room, drawing minimal attention deliberately. She wore the same gear as every other gunner, fleece-lined leather flight jacket, heated suit connections trailing from her clothing, oxygen mask hanging around her neck. In the dim light of the briefing room, she was just another silhouette among many. Major William Hastings, the group intelligence officer, stood beside the map and delivered information that made the mathematics of survival abundantly clear. "Gentlemen, today's target is the Bosch Electrical Works in Stuttgart. This is a maximum effort mission. We're putting up 21 aircraft from this group as part of a 300-bomber strike. Expected enemy fighter opposition, heavy flak concentrations along the route severe." He had paused, looking at the assembled crews. The Luftwaffe has been reinforcing their fighter groups in southern Germany. Intelligence estimates will face approximately 200 German fighters at various points during the mission. They will focus their attacks during our bomb run, when we're flying straight and level. The mission planning called for the bombers to fly at 25,000 FT, where the temperature would hover around minus 40 degrees F. At that altitude, any equipment failure could be fatal. Oxygen systems had to function perfectly, or crews would lose consciousness in minutes. Electrically heated flight suits had to work, or exposed skin would suffer frost, bite in seconds. Lieutenant Raymond Cooper's crew had gathered around their aircraft at 0530 hours for the pre-flight inspection. The B-7F they would fly that day bore the name Valiant Venture painted on her nose, along with 12 bomb symbols representing completed missions. Cooper was a 23-year-old pilot from Oregon on his 8th combat mission. When Fletcher arrived at the aircraft carrying her flight gear, the crew's reaction was mixed. Some had heard about the training flight incident with the FW-190. Others were simply trying to process the reality of flying into combat with a woman aboard their aircraft. Technical Sergeant Paul Anderson, the top turret gunner and crew chief, had pulled Fletcher aside before she boarded. "Ma'am, no disrespect, but some of the guys are nervous. Not because of you specifically, but because, well, this is different. We've never done this before." Fletcher had understood what he wasn't saying. These men had trained together, flown together, and watched other crews die together. They had formed bonds based on shared experience and mutual trust. She was an outsider being inserted into a crew dynamic that had been forged under fire. "Sergeant Anderson," she had replied, "I'm not here to make anyone comfortable. I'm here to man the starboard waist gun and protect this aircraft from enemy fighters. That's my job. I know how to do it. If the crew does their jobs and I do mine, we'll all come home. That's the only thing that matters." Anderson had nodded slowly. "Fair enough, ma'am. Welcome aboard." The takeoff had occurred at 0647 hours. 21 B-17s from the 306th Bombardment Group had lifted off from Fully at 30-second intervals, each bomber carrying 10 men, 6 tons of bombs, and enough .050 caliber ammunition to sustain extended combat. Fletcher had taken her position at the starboard waist gun once the bomber reached altitude. The waist gun position was a brutally uncomfortable place to spend 8 hours. The gunner stood in an open window with freezing air screaming past at 180 mph. The gun itself weighed 84 pounds and had to be manually tracked and fired while wearing heavy gloves and breathing through an oxygen mask. The formation had crossed the English Channel at 0745 hours. By 0830, they had penetrated German-controlled airspace over occupied France. The intercom crackled with constant communication between crew positions, each man reporting what he saw in his sector of sky. At 0912 hours, the first German fighters appeared. The tail gunner's voice came over the intercom. "Fighters 600 level for bandits looks like BF-1009s." Fletcher had rotated her gun to cover her sector, scanning the sky through her gun sight. The German fighters typically attacked from the rear and sides, trying to avoid the concentrated defensive fire from the bombers' front-facing guns. The attack pattern the Luftwaffe had perfected was brutally efficient. Fighters would approach from the rear at slightly higher altitude, build up speed in a shallow dive, and then make high-speed passes through the bomber formation, firing their 20 mm cannons and 13 mm machine guns in short bursts before breaking away. At 0918 hours, a Messerschmitt Bf-109 rolled into an attack run from 400 high, the same angle from which the FW-190 had approached during the training flight. Fletcher had tracked the fighter. Her gun sight calculated the deflection angle based on the fighter's speed and angle of attack, and waited for the range to close. The key to aerial gunnery was fire discipline. Ammunition was limited, and most German fighter attacks occurred at ranges exceeding 1000 yards. At that distance, the probability of hitting a fast-moving fighter was minimal. Expert gunners waited until the range closed to 400 YD or less before firing. The Bf-109 closed to 500 YD. Fletcher had kept tracking her gun sight, leading the fighter by approximately 25 ft to compensate for deflection. At 400 YD, she pressed the trigger. firing a 3-second burst that sent approximately 60 rounds of .050 caliber ammunition toward the fighter's projected position. The gun camera footage reviewed later showed her tracer rounds converging on the fighter. The Bf-1009's left wing erupted in a spray of aluminum fragments. The fighter broke off its attack, rolling away with visible damage to its wing surface. Over the next 40 minutes, as the bomber formation pushed deeper into Germany, Fletcher engaged 3 more fighters. Each time, she demonstrated the same fire discipline and deflection shooting skills that had put her at the top of her training class. She didn't fire wildly or waste ammunition. She waited for clean shots at reasonable ranges and fired controlled bursts. The bomb run over began at 1:47 hours. For 6 minutes, the bombers flew straight and level at 25:00 FT, while bombardiers synchronized their bomb sights with the target below. During those 6 minutes, the bombers were most vulnerable. They couldn't maneuver defensively without disrupting the bomb run. The German fighters knew this and concentrated their attacks during this window. Valiant Venture's bombardier, 2nd Lieutenant Thomas Wright, had his eye pressed to the Norden bomb site, making minute adjustments to ensure accuracy. The pilot, Lieutenant Cooper, held the controls steady despite the flak bursts erupting around them, black flowers of smoke and shrapnel that could shred an aircraft in seconds. At 1:51 hours, a fall-off FW-190 executed what fighter pilots called a head-on attack, one of the most dangerous maneuvers in aerial combat. The fighter approached from 12:00 level directly in front of the bomber, creating a closing speed of nearly 450 mph. This gave both the fighter and the bombers' gunners only seconds to fire before the fighter flashed past. Fletcher had rotated her waist gun forward as far as its mount would allow, trying to get an angle on the attacking fighter. The nose gunner and top turret gunner opened fire simultaneously. The FW-90's guns flashed as it fired its own weapons. Fletcher had tracked the fighter through her sight and fired a 4-second burst just as the fighter began to break away. The fighter rolled left in dove-trailing smoke. Whether her fire or the combined fire from multiple gun positions had caused the damage was impossible to determine in the chaos of combat, but the fighter was clearly hit. At 1:53 hours, Wright's voice came over the intercom, "Bombs away." 6 tons of high-explosive bombs dropped from Valiant Venture to bomb bay along with thousands of other bombs from the formation. Cooper immediately banked the bomber and began the long flight back to England. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The flight back to England was when bomber crews died. German fighter pilots knew the Americans were most vulnerable during the return journey. The bombers had expended their bombs, making them lighter and harder to control in formation. Crews were exhausted from hours of high-altitude flight and the adrenaline crash following the bomb run. Wounded aircraft struggled to maintain altitude and formation integrity. At 1:27 hours, approximately 40 minutes after leaving, the Luftwaffe launched what crews called a maximum effort intercept. Intelligence officers estimated later that approximately 75 German fighters engaged the bomber formation over a 30-mile stretch of airspace above the French-German border. The attacks came from multiple angles simultaneously, a tactic designed to overwhelm the bombers' defensive fire. Fighters approached from 12:00 high 6:00 level and 3:00 low in coordinated waves. The defensive gunners had to prioritize targets, knowing they couldn't engage every attacking fighter. Fletcher's intercom discipline remained perfect despite the chaos. She called out each fighter she engaged, gave range estimates, and reported results. Fighter for a clock high, 600 YD, engaging 3 seconds of fire. Fighter breaking right. Possible hits to fuselage. The starboard waist gun position gave her responsibility for the entire right side of the aircraft from approximately 2:00 to 5:00. Any fighter attacking from those angles was her responsibility. The gun itself generated its own challenges. The Browning M2 fired 800 rounds per minute, which meant ammunition management was critical. Each ammunition box contained approximately 500 rounds, enough for 37 seconds of continuous fire. Fletcher changed ammunition boxes 4 times during the mission, a process that required temporarily abandoning her gun position to lift the 35 lb boxes into place. At 134 hours, a Bf-109 executed a beam attack from 300 level, approaching perpendicular to the bomber's flight path. This created the most difficult deflection shooting problem in aerial gunnery. The fighter was moving at approximately 350 mph at a 90 degrees angle to the bomber's 180 mph forward speed. Calculating the correct lead required instantaneous mental trigonometry that most gunners never mastered. Fletcher had tracked the fighter through her sight, leading it by approximately 40 ft, the distance her father had taught her to judge by instinct rather than calculation. She fired a 4-second on burst. The gun camera footage showed her tracers converging on the fighter's engine cowling. The Bf-1009's propeller flew off in a spray of metal fragments, and the fighter rolled, inverted, and began spinning toward the ground 25,000 ft below. Lieutenant Cooper's voice came over the intercom. "Good shooting, Fletcher. That's a confirmed kill." Engagement continued for another 18 minutes. During that time, Fletcher engaged 7 more fighters at ranges varying from 700 IDS to 300 YD. She fired a total of 1,847 rounds, approximately 23% of her total ammunition load. Her fire discipline remained constant. Wait for reasonable range, calculate deflection, fire control bursts, assess results, move to next target. At 152 hours, the German fighter attacks ceased as suddenly as they had begun. The Luftwaffe pilots had reached their fuel limits and had to break off to return to their bases. The bomber formation continued westward, now flying over occupied France toward the English Channel. The damage assessment revealed the cost of the mission. Of the 21 B-7s that had taken off from Phi that morning, 18 were returning. 3 bombers had been shot down over Germany, their crews killed or captured. Every returning bomber showed some degree of battle damage. Valiant Venture had taken hits from fighter cannon fire in the tail section and from flak fragments in the left wing, but all critical systems remained functional. Inside Valiant Venture, the crew conducted their own assessment. The ball turret gunner, Sergeant Dennis Miller, had sustained a minor shrapnel wound to his left hand from a flak fragment that had penetrated the turret. The navigator, Second Lieutenant Howard Clean, had counted 47 holes in the aircraft's aluminum skin, ranging from small caliber bullet holes to fist-sized tears from cannon shells. Fletcher's position showed evidence of the intensity of her engagement. Spent .050 caliber shell casings covered the floor of the waist gun compartment to a depth of 3 in. The barrel of her gun glowed cherry red from the heat of sustained firing. The ammunition boxes were nearly empty. Technical Sergeant Anderson had made his way back to Fletcher's position during the flight home. He had surveyed the scene, the spent casings, the empty ammunition boxes, the glowing gun barrel, and nodded slowly. "You did good, Sergeant," he had said through the intercom. "Real good. That beam attack kill was something I've only seen a handful of times. Most gunners can't make that shot." At 147 hours, Valiant Venture crossed the English coast. At 423 hours, the bomber touched down at Flea, the 18th aircraft to land. The ground crew counted the holes, assessed the damage, and began the process of repair that would make the aircraft mission ready again. When Fletcher climbed out of the waist gun hatch, her flight suit was soaked with sweat despite the -40 degrees temperatures. At altitude, her hands shook slightly from 8 hours of gripping the gun's spade grips. Her face showed the distinctive mask marks where the oxygen mask had pressed against her skin for hours. Lieutenant Colonel Davies was waiting on the hard stand when the crew climbed down from the bomber. He walked directly to Lieutenant Cooper. "How did your new gunner perform, Lieutenant?" Cooper had glanced at Fletcher, then back at Davies. "Sir, she got a confirmed kill on a beam attack at 134 hours. She damaged at least 4 other fighters that I observed. Her fire discipline was better than some gunners I've flown with for months. She did her job, that's all that matters up there." Davies had turned to Fletcher. "Sergeant, report to my office at 1600 hours for debriefing." The debriefing Session at 1, 600 hours included Davies, Major Hastings, the intelligence officer, and Captain Edmund Walsh from 8th Air Force Headquarters. Walsh had flown in from Hiwacam specifically to observe and assess Fletcher's performance. The gun camera footage was reviewed frame by frame. The beam attack kill was confirmed. 3 damaged fighters were classified as probable kills. Aircraft damage severely enough that they likely didn't make it back to their bases. 2 more were classified as damaged. Aircraft hit, but likely repairable. Walsh had watched the footage 3 times before speaking. Sergeant Fletcher, I'm going to be frank with you. When I learned about this experiment, I had significant reservations. Those reservations were based on doctrine, regulation, and frankly, assumptions about capability. The gun camera footage suggests my assumptions were incorrect. He had paused, choosing his words carefully. However, this creates a significant problem for the chain of command. You've just flown a combat mission that, according to Army regulations, you're prohibited from flying. You've performed at a level that makes those regulations look problematic. The question now is what happens next. Davies had interjected. Captain Walsh, with respect, I have 3 more bombers sitting on hard stands that can't fly because I don't have enough trained gunners. Sergeant Fletcher is trained. She's proven she can do the job under combat conditions. I need her flying. Walsh had shaken his head. Colonel, it's not that simple. This will go all the way to Washington. There will be questions from Congress, from the War Department, from people who believe women shouldn't be anywhere near combat. The fact that Sergeant Fletcher performed exceptionally well may not be enough to overcome institutional resistance. Fletcher had remained silent through this exchange, standing at attention while officers debated her future. Finally, Davies had addressed her directly. Sergeant, you're dismissed. Get some food and rest. I'll inform you of any decisions regarding your status. September 4th, 1943, 08:30 hours. Fletcher had reported to the operations office and instructed, expecting either assignment to another mission or orders transferring her away from Flee. What she received instead was something no one had anticipated. Colonel Patterson, the operations officer who had originally reviewed her personnel file, had arrived from 8th Air Force Headquarters overnight. He sat in Davies' office with a telegram in his hand and an expression that suggested he was dealing with something unprecedented. Sergeant Fletcher Patterson had begun. Yesterday's mission has created complications. Gun camera footage from multiple aircraft confirmed your performance. The intelligence assessment rates you as one of the most effective gunners in yesterday's operation. That should be good news. He had paused looking at the telegram. However, 3 different departments at the War Department have now become aware of your participation in combat operations. There are questions about how this happened, whether regulations were violated, and what precedent this sets. Some very senior officers are very unhappy. Fletcher had maintained her bearing. Sir, I followed orders. I was assigned to a crew and flew the mission I was assigned to fly. I understand that, Sergeant. The problem isn't your performance or your conduct. The problem is that your performance was too good to ignore. If you had been mediocre, this might have been swept under the rug as an administrative error, but you scored a confirmed kill and multiple probables on your first combat mission. That's going to be in the official records. It can't be hidden or dismissed. Davies had leaned forward. Sir, what's the War Department's position? Patterson had set down the telegram. They don't have one yet. That's the problem. This situation doesn't fit any existing framework. Women aren't supposed to be in combat, but when one woman enters combat and performs at the highest level, what does that mean for the policy? What Patterson didn't say, but what Fletcher understood, was that her success created a threat to assumptions that underpin the entire military's gender policy. If one woman could perform aerial combat duties at an elite level, it raised questions about why women were excluded from combat roles entirely. For 3 days, Fletcher existed in bureaucratic limbo. She attended training exercises, maintained her weapons qualifications, and avoided discussing the September 3rd mission with anyone. The other gunners at Phi treated her with a new respect, but also with uncertainty about whether she would fly again. On September 7th, Lieutenant Cooper's Received orders for a mission to Bremen, Germany, scheduled for September 8th. The crew roster included Fletcher's name as starboard waist gunner. The mission briefing on September 8th proceeded normally until Major Hastings announced the target and expected opposition. Gentleman and Sergeant Fletcher, today's target is the Fallhof aircraft factory at Bremen. This is a maximum priority target. The Luftwaffe is producing approximately 200 FW-190 fighters per month at this facility. Our job is to stop that production. The mission launched at 071 5 hours with 22 B-17s from the 306th Bombardment Group. Fletcher took her position at the starboard waist gun, went through her pre-flight checks, and prepared for what intelligence briefings suggested would be even heavier fighter opposition than the Stuttgart mission. The German defenders did not disappoint. At 0947 hours as the bomber formation approached Bremen from the north, approximately 100 Luftwaffe fighters rose to meet them. The attacks began at 0953 hours and continued for 37 minutes straight, the longest sustained fighter engagement Fletcher had experienced. The tactics Fletcher had developed during the guard mission proved effective again. She maintained fire discipline, waited for clean shots at reasonable ranges, and called out every engagement over the intercom. By the time the bomber formation reached Bremen at 10:31 hours, she had engaged 11 separate fighters and scored hits on at least 6 of them. The bomb run over the Fall factory occurred at 10:34 hours. The plant was clearly visible from 25,000 FT, a sprawling complex of buildings where Germany's most effective fighter aircraft were manufactured. The anti-aircraft fire was the heaviest Fletcher had encountered, with flak bursts creating a nearly solid wall of explosions around the bomber formation. Valiant Venture's bomber Deer released bombs at 10:36 hours. Through the bomb bay, Fletcher could see other bombers' ordnance falling toward the factory. The plant disappeared beneath a blanket of explosions and smoke as thousands of pounds of high explosives detonated across the facility. The return journey saw another 28 minutes of fighter attacks. Fletcher's ammunition expenditure was higher than the first mission, 134 rounds fired in total. Her confirmed kills included 2 Bf-1009s and 1 FW-190. For more, fighters were classified as probable kills. When Valiant Venture landed at Flea at 1418 hours, the bomber showed extensive battle damage. The tail section had taken cannon fire that had wounded tail gunner Sergeant Philip Carson, who had continued fighting despite injuries to his shoulder. The left wing showed damage from flak fragments, but the aircraft had made it home, as had 19 of 22 bombers that had launched that morning. The mission debriefing revealed something that Colonel Davies found remarkable. Valiant Venture had been engaged by more fighters than any other bomber in the formation. Intelligence analysts counted 23 separate attack runs against the aircraft. Yet, the bomber had sustained less damage than many aircraft that had faced lighter opposition. Technical Sergeant Anderson provided his assessment during the crew debriefing. "Sir, the German fighters were targeting us specifically. We got hit more than any other aircraft in our formation, but our defensive fire was effective enough that most of the fighters broke off their attacks early. They weren't pressing their runs all the way in because they were taking too much fire." What Anderson didn't say explicitly, but what everyone in the debriefing understood, was that Fletcher's gunnery was a significant factor in that defensive effectiveness. Fighters attacking from the starboard side had learned that pressing their attacks against Valiant Venture meant facing accurate defensive fire from a gunner who didn't waste ammunition but hit what she aimed at. September 15th, 1943. Lieutenant Cooper's crew had flown 4 missions in 12 days. This was an unusually high operational tempo, but the 8th Air Force was pushing maximum effort as autumn weather approached. Each mission had featured Fletcher at the starboard waist gun. Each mission had seen her add to her tally of confirmed kills and damaged aircraft. The statistics were becoming impossible to ignore. Fletcher's confirmed kill total stood at 5 enemy fighters destroyed, with another 8 classified as probable kills and 6 more as damaged. In 4 missions, she had fired 923 rounds of .050 caliber ammunition. Her accuracy rate, measured by the percentage of her rounds that resulted in observable hits on enemy aircraft, stood at 18%, more than double the average gunner's rate of 7%. More significantly, Valiant Venture had become one of the most successful bombers in the 306th Bombardment Group. Despite being targeted heavily by German fighters on every mission, the aircraft had sustained relatively moderate damage and had never failed to complete a mission. The crew had begun to believe that their defensive capabilities were giving them an edge in survival. That belief was tested on September 15th during a mission to Mannheim, Germany. The target was a synthetic fuel plant critical to the German war effort. The mission briefing had warned of expected heavy fighter opposition and severe flak concentrations. The mission launched at 0645 hours with 24 B-17s from Fleet. Fletcher took her usual position, performed her usual checks, and prepared for what had become a familiar routine. Hours of uncomfortable flight punctuated by minutes of intense aerial combat. The German fighters appeared at 1:04 hours earlier than usual. Intelligence analysts later determined that the Luftwaffe had detected the bomber formation's approach and had scrambled fighters while the Americans were still 75 mi from the target. This gave the German pilots more time and more fuel to engage the bombers. What followed was the most intense aerial combat Fletcher had experienced. Between 4 hours and 127 hours, 73 minutes of continuous engagement, the bomber formation was under constant attack. German fighters attacked in coordinated waves, with fresh fighters replacing those that had expended their ammunition or fuel. Fletcher's intercom discipline began to break down under the pressure. Instead of calling out every engagement, she simply fought, tracking fighters, calculating deflection, firing controlled bursts, moving to the next target. The waist gun compartment filled with spent shell casings that rose above her ankles, making footing treacherous. The gun barrel glowed white hot. Twice she had to cease fire for 30 seconds to allow the barrel to cool enough to continue operating. At 1:47 hours, a formation of 6 Bf-1009s executed a coordinated attack on Valiant Ventures. Specifically, 3 fighters approached from 600 level, 2 from 400 high, and 1 from 200 low. The simultaneous multi-angle attack was designed to overwhelm the bombers' defensive fire. Fletcher engaged the 2 fighters approaching from 400 high, her assigned sector. She hit the lead fighter with a sustained burst that set its engine on fire. The second fighter pressed its attack despite her fire, closing to within 300 YD before its 20 mm cannon shells began hitting Valiant Venture's right wing. The top turret gunner, Anderson, engaged the fighters attacking from 600. The ball turret gunner engaged the fighter attacking from below. The coordinated defensive fire damaged or destroyed 4 of the 6 attacking fighters, but not before the bombers sustained significant damage. Lieutenant Cooper's voice came over the intercom comm. Despite the situation, we've taken hits to number 3 engine, shutting it down, also damage to the hydraulic system. We're losing altitude gradually. Continue defensive fire. We're staying with the formation as long as possible. A B-7 could fly on 3 engines, but performance degraded significantly. Valiant Venture began dropping behind the main formation, losing approximately 50 ft of altitude per minute. This was a death sentence in aerial combat. Stragglers attracted German fighters like blood and water attracted sharks. The German pilots recognized the wounded bomber immediately. At 1:53 hours, 3 FW-190s broke away from attacking the main formation and turned toward Valiant Venture. They approached from the bombers' most vulnerable angle, 600 low, where the tail gunner's field of fire was limited. Fletcher rotated her waist gun as far as the mount would allow, trying to get an angle on the attacking fighters. The range was extreme, nearly 800 YD, but she fired anyway, trying to disrupt their approach. Her tracers arced toward the fighters, falling short but close enough to make the pilots maneuver defensively. The tail gunner, Sergeant Carson, still fighting despite his wounded shoulder, engage the fighters as they close to 400 wide D. His fire hit the lead FW-190, causing it to break away trailing smoke. The other two fighters pressed their attack, their cannon shelled. Walking up the bomber's fuselage toward the tail section, Carson's gun fell silent. His voice came over the intercom, strained with pain. Tail gun hit. I'm hit. Guns out of action with the tail gun. Disabled. Valiant Venture's 6-0-0 position was now defended only by the ball turret gunner, whose field of fire didn't cover high angles. Fletcher made a decision that violated every protocol she had been taught. She disconnected her oxygen line, grabbed a portable oxygen bottle that provided 10 minutes of oxygen, and moved from her position at the starboard waist gun to the port waist gun, which offered a better angle toward the rear of the aircraft. The move took 40 seconds during which the starboard side of the bomber was completely undefended. She reached the port waist gun, plugged in her oxygen line, and immediately engaged the two FW-190s that were setting up for another attack run. The angle was still poor, requiring her to fire almost directly aft. The deflection calculation was nearly impossible because the fighters were approaching from directly behind the bomber, meaning their relative motion was minimal. She fired a sustained burst of nearly 200 rounds, walking her fire across the sky until her tracers converged on the lead fighter. The FW-190 exploded in midair. Whether she had hit the fighter's fuel tank or ammunition storage was irrelevant. Aircraft disintegrated in a fireball that caused the second fighter to break away from its attack run. Anderson's voice came over the intercom. Outstanding shooting, Fletcher. You just saved our tail, literally, but the bomber's situation remained critical. Valiant Venture had fallen to 0.00 FT behind the main formation and was continuing to lose altitude. Number 3 engine was completely shut down, and the damage to the hydraulic system meant that landing would be problematic even if they made it back to England. Lieutenant Cooper's voice remained calm. All crew, prepare for possible bailout. We're going to try to make it to the channel, but if we lose another engine, we're not going to make it. Stand by. The 8 bombers that Fletcher protected during 25 combat missions carried 80 men. Those men returned home because her defensive gunnery helped keep their aircraft flying through the most intense aerial combat of World War II. The mathematics were simple. Skill applied at the right moment saved lives. Gender never entered the equation when bullets were flying. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.